Hello, today is Tuesday, August 13th, 2019. This is the Standard Conformance Office Hours, a subproject of SIG architecture. I will share my screen and we'll walk through the agenda. If folks could fill out details if you're here, that'd be highly useful. Does someone want to take notes by chance? Bueller.
I can take notes.
Okay, thank you, Hippie. So first up was Hippie to review the pod spec coverage. I did see your initial posts in the conformance channel that just looked kind of similar to the original one. Do you have data to share? I can't hear you if you're talking.
No, I don't have data this morning, but I hope to have it by this afternoon.
Okay.
Just wanted to make sure that this is really what we were looking for. We didn't get too much feedback on the data format.
It seemed reasonable because it looked like a slight modification from the original thing that you had shown.
Okay.
But it had a couple of extra columns, which I thought I was fine with. I think the key thing is we just wanted to get the data at this point. So next up is the amount of soak time for new E2E test prior to promotion. Two weeks. I don't have hard opinions here. I kind of wish Aaron was on the call. Is he on the call?
I don't see him.
Right. 2 weeks seems reasonable to me. I think one release cycle might be a bit too much.
I think it is too. It's kind of restricting.
Yeah.
This actually came out of discussing with Aaron this topic, and he suggested 2 weeks. I won't speak for him any further than that, but that's where I got the 2 weeks from. It seems like a reasonable amount of time, though somewhat arbitrary. So yeah, if anybody has other ideas, I'm open to that.
So I'm just going to assign it to Aaron for triaging because they would have the most data.
And so is this just sort of validated by like look at test grid and scroll right until you see enough green?
What's the question now that I'm here?
The amount of soak time for promotion.
So what I had tossed off anecdotally was like, I need to see at least like a week or two. But I want to understand if the rest of this group is in consensus with that.
I mean, that's reasonable to me. The main thing is just to see it's not flaking, and I think that's sufficient time to see that it's not like very flaky.
And what sort of number should we be using for not very flaky?
I mean,
that's why I'm like wary of putting too hard a number to this. Though I can, it'll take time to get to a hard number and understand whether or not that starts to kick out other stuff.
I mean, yeah.
I mean, instead of saying time, should we just say iterations? Because I mean, we could have one run in 2 weeks.
Not for conformance tests.
That would be less than ideal. So ideally, every conformance test, because it is not slow, flaky, disruptive, or depends on a feature, will be part of the release master blocking set of jobs in one form or another.
Okay.
And those need to, right now the set of criteria we have is those need to run at least every 3 hours. They must take no more than 2 hours to complete. There are jobs that are wildly in violation of this, for what it's worth. And then there's some just best guesses at numbers on amount of times the job should pass and should not be flaky, I think is the verbiage. Like, I don't think we actually have language around what level of flakiness is permitted.
So it sounds like this should say for at least 2 weeks following the cadence of blocking tests.
I'm fine tying it to that.
Okay.
blocking release jobs, they runs 4 to 8 times a day.
So why don't we add that little quip there to the end of this, and then Aaron, I assigned you to it.
Okay. I mean, the other option is if the group is comfortable, we could just start adding tests right away. But I want to understand what this group's level of comfort is. When we want to get to the point where we're starting to add new tests, what's the soak time we want to put in front of us?
I'm okay with 2. I'm okay with the magic number baking. It's not like half of Kubernetes has magic numbers inside of it. So I think for the time being, take a first stab at it, see if it works, and if we need to, we can refine. If it's not fast.
I don't think we should add them directly. I mean, I think we should give them a little bit of soak time.
Works.
Next up, getting subject matter experts.
Yeah,
Is
I
this
thought
the
you
signal?
pinged me on this. I can find somebody, but yeah, it's difficult sometimes. You just gotta poke people.
So this was my thing where I feel like occasionally Tim and I kind of swoop in and try to figure out like what is going on within this test. And we can make a best effort, but Tim and I are both motivated to be like kind of pushy. We are not the people who originally wrote these tests, nor are we the people who like have the domain expertise to really dig into, is this an appropriate behavior? Does it need to be exercised in a specific way? We need those subject matter experts. Like we can't just kind of keep making these guesses for ourselves.
Well, this particular one is, you're missing a call down here, and I don't know why it was removed.
So if we want to dig into the specifics of this, the deal is that this is a test that call that was removed was a call that exercises the kubelets undocumented on versioned API, which we all collectively agreed is not something we want to allow for conformance tests.
Oh my gosh, this call percolates down to the kubelet API?
Correct. So the reason this call does that is because there's checking about whether or not the state of the world looks the way it should according to the control plane. And then there's this call that percolates down and asks the kubelet, is the state of your fiefdom the same as the state of the control plane's view of your fiefdom? And that seems excessive to me. So if I just want to be pushy and promote this, I would be like, well, remove those because we don't need those because we don't want this to talk to the kubelet API. What I don't have is the subject matter expert in front of me saying, no, actually we need to hear from the kubelet to see what its state of the world is. Otherwise, this is not a valid way of exercising this behavior. So I need somebody to sign off and say, yes, you know what, the control plane's view of the world is good enough. That was the specific thing that motivated this.
I'm slightly terrified that this particular call percolates all the way down to the kubelet. But
it does. The issue I linked where we sort of wrote the policy, and then I wrote an issue that linked to like navigating down all the call stacks for all the tests, which ones end up touching something that proxies to the kubelet. And this is one of them.
But in general, we do need to have the domain experts decide on promotion of the tests. They should be part of the approval process. And I think that kind of happens naturally because so Aaron, if you approve something, it'll approve for all the whole like directory tree. But like when I go in and I'm like, okay, I wanna approve this, it's only gonna approve a subset of that. So I need to go talk to Node, or I need to go talk to apps, or I need to go talk to scheduling and get somebody there to approve if the file's being touched that's owned by them. So in that sense, like we do get from the owner's files some natural need to have people do it. But I don't think we should be in this group always just deciding to promote things unless we have concurrence with those subject matter.
I am gaining subject matter expertise, but when I need to ask a question, like I just don't think it should be Tim or I answering that question. We should be tapping somebody on the shoulder.
And you did that. So there's been a long-standing problem with certain SIGs being responsive.
Right.
And I don't know how you change that, to be honest.
It's a human. You just have to go like poke somebody directly. Everybody's responsible, nobody's responsible issue, right? You can't just tag a whole SIG.
Okay, so how can we make not everybody responsible, and how can we get a group of people who are responsible? Because it sounds like our hack would be, hey, John, you happen to work next to a bunch of Googlers who are domain experts in a few specific areas. We'll just use you as our HA proxy shoulder tap.
Which is definitely not ideal, right?
Right.
I had a quick question from the sidelines here. So we have a PR open. I just happened to notice to document what these tests should and should not do, and what they should look like and what they should not look like. That seems like the right place to decide, access to the kubelet API is okay under these conditions or not okay ever or whatever, as opposed to deal with it on an ad hoc basis and try and get responses out of experts.
He did that.
I did that. I documented the policy, and these are some of the tests that violate that. And so now we need to figure out for these violations, number one, we could just kick them out. Boom, done, don't care. But now does that mean we're not exercising these behaviors? And then are these behaviors valid behaviors that should function across all Kubernetes clusters? If so, could we please have the tests, could we have these behaviors exercised in a way that lines up with our conformance guidelines?
Sorry, just to clarify, so that issue that's open that doesn't have any PR associated with it that I'm aware of.
Do you think you could link that issue so we can see what you're talking about?
Sure, I can dig it up. It was the how to write good conformance tests document required issue. I can pull the number out.
Right.
Yeah.
We've been updating that as we get feedback and requirements, and as we get more general, but I think there's a difference between what makes a good conformance test overall and those overall requirements, and digging down to the specific subject matter expert who may have context enough. When we get pushback on this isn't a good idea, the idea has been to ask them if we should create an update to the requirements doc or not.
Okay. I think we're doing all the right things. I think the problem has nothing to do with the context of writing a good test, or has nothing to do with whether or not we've documented it, because Aaron has, right? He asked the question, he did the work. I think the point of the matter is how do we use carrot and stick philosophy to get the right behavior from the SIGs that are not responsive, to get them to make the call on some of these issues. And the answer that I have for Aaron is, I don't know how. This has been a systemic problem. That we'd have to somehow promote some methodology or policy to get priority for them to do these things. Now, different SIGs behave differently. We, in SIG cluster lifecycle, we have a mantra of constant triage. So there's somebody that should always be triaging inbound. And if it's inbound and it's not triaged and somebody's not assigned, then we do something about it. But that's not the same for other SIGs. So I don't know how you get API machinery to move on issues that are 6 months old, or how to do that for SIG node 2. I don't know how you do that.
So one thought ostensibly is all the SIGs really care about active participation within SIG architecture. This is a sub-project of SIG architecture. The folks who are showing up at SIG architecture are the folks we should be tapping on the shoulder. If you're not showing up to our meetings, apparently you're off doing whatever. But I have a really tough time believing that people from API machinery, node, storage, and networking don't show up to SIG architecture. And that's maybe the lever that I would use. Like if your SIG doesn't have a person dedicated to triaging this, if we are feeding back that we are not getting appropriate response times from your SIG, you don't.
So we have a few things going on that, like, we also now have a requirement that people do conformance tests for GA features. So like we have a number of, this is one demand we put on SIGs is, hey, can you review this existing test and see if it's functionally appropriate? And then another is, hey, you need to write some new tests for your new stuff. So it seems like we have sort of a confluence of things that are trying to, that we need this process, or this stick. Really, it's a stick at this point that we can use. And maybe to make that easy, we add, like when we do our project updates in SIG-Arch, we should add a little section where we say, hey, here are the open issues we need input from this SIG, this SIG, this SIG. And as soon as they go to the meeting, like Aaron's saying, then at least they'll be sort of notified if it flew by without anybody seeing it.
That seems fair. I think we could add an action item that we need response from SIG node on these particular issues. One thing we might want to do prior, just so we do our due diligence, is prior to the next SIG Arch meeting, scrub the backlog for any other issues, or at least notify on the conformance Slack channel of somebody doing a scrub to verify what we're all waiting on. So that way we're at least complete in our assessment.
Yep. I feel like I have seen, so I'm also selfishly interested in this so that John and I don't have to be the shoulder tappers. We have these contractors. I want to make sure they're empowered to get what they need without us being middlemen. I feel like I have seen folks from II ping the conformance Slack channel with not a whole lot of feedback or response. I wish I could see more response when they do that. It also makes me think like that apparently isn't an effective channel for escalation. Could it be that they should instead be mailing the SIG architecture mailing list and saying, hey, we have a question. We need somebody to respond to this from SIG node?
I think that's probably, I find typically that the mailing list is more effective than Slack. You could hit -devel and -arch, and I think that would be a reasonable way to approach this.
So is it
SIG Arch and what?
is it possible for us to just attend the SIG meeting and put that on the agenda and talk to them? That's
yes, but that's like a week away, or like, I don't know if it's this week or not. I've lost track. But sometimes the interval is offset.
So go to the SIG meeting in question. So SIG node meeting, SIG network meeting, whatever. But I know like SIG network, we only meet every 2 weeks. Like, so that's a pretty slow cadence.
Yeah. So I think asynchronous response times would be preferred, right? So like I think if we do our due diligence here, I think an action item would be for us to scrub all the things we're waiting on, and then send the public admonishment email to the different content areas as well as SIG Arch. Does that seem like an appropriate way to handle this for the time being? And we can actually come back to this and determine whether or not that public shaming is sufficient enough.
That is fine by me. And this is, for what it's worth, why I want us to progress on, like, instead of having to ping these people piecemeal, we get them all in a room and shake them until a list of behaviors comes out so that we don't have to bother them this way going forward.
Yep. Are there any other questions here? I think the next step is listed above, so I don't know what this one's all about here. I'm going to, unless there's any other comments here, I'm going to skip down to validation suites and then come back to triage backlog. I know I put a comment on this when I was looking through it recently. I still...
the reason that prompted to talk about this.
Yeah, I'm on, so I responded to your comment, Tim. I don't know if you had a chance to read what I responded.
Nope, I do a scrub once every like 4 or 5 days, so I do not respond regularly.
Okay.
Or I respond regularly, but not immediately. Right.
So do you all want to just take a second to read what I wrote, or you want me to do it verbally? I'd be happy to do it either way, whatever is most productive.
So your first statement here, just the very first statement here, I don't even understand.
All right, so let me try and explain, right? The premise of this is if you're going to think about conformance profiles, okay, that the ideal thing, if it's possible, is there should be a process where you at least check and say, maybe we could go ahead and move it into the core conformance. Because you'd like to do that first. Because the whole world is a lot happier if there's just one set of core conformance tests. So that's what you'd like to happen if you can. Now, if that can't happen, and we'll see when there's cases when it can happen, and we all agree that there needs to be profiles. Okay, maybe there needs to be a storage profile, for example. Once you turn that key and say, we want to start having profiles, now you need to be very careful, because what you want to happen is, if you're going to go down that route and you convince yourself you need it, you're probably going to want to have multiple conformance profiles aggregated together so that they look like all the major vendors are essentially providing the same functionality. The scariness comes from my real world experience of running this in a previous cloud infrastructure. I was the lead for what was called the Interoperability Challenge, and I had to make sure we could run portable workloads across 15 different cloud infrastructures, public, private, what have you. And I had to do it live on stage. And I couldn't imagine pulling that off successfully if we start allowing, let's say we create 5 new profiles, and every vendor, Google, Amazon, whoever, starts supporting their own desired subsets of those profiles. Then you can just say, you know what, we've lost. We really don't have interoperability. We really don't have workload portability, because everybody had so much free range to make those decisions instead of taking the time to do consensus building, where you would at least take the time to say, no, let's all agree that these new 4 profiles we created are really the ones that are going to meet what we call the enterprise platform, for lack of a better term, because maybe they'll be like, well, we want something for Raspberry Pis. That's always the case that comes up. We want something for the small, and that's why we want to be able to do something light. That's fine. But for the majority of folks who are trying to do the things, you'd like it to appear like there was a process in place where, let's say you create 4 new profiles, that all the big vendors would have a process where we could agree we're all going to support those profiles, and you could merge them together. So what that is trying to argue for is we ought to be slow and deliberate and consensus building as we try and come up with profiles. Now, that's all well and good, but what I talk about in the comment is how frustrating that is for a DIMS or a Srini who says, listen, and we all have this discussion in KubeCon Seattle, we still need to start building out these tests. I need to be able to experiment with them. I need to kick the tires. I need to work with the SIGs. I need to get rolling on this. And I understand you conformance folks need to have a little bit of process to make sure silly things don't happen. And so this was a way of saying, go build your validation suites. Go come up and kick the tires, experiment, add, release, whatever. And then as they get mature, look at those validation suites and now have a process that says, let's find a way to decide if they go into core or if we need to actually merge them into a conformance profile. Because if we're going to do that, let's kind of aggregate them together so we don't end up with every public cloud platform supporting their own desired subset of, let's say you've got 6 profiles and each one supports 4 of them and it's a different set of 4. Then you've lost on conformance. And so this was a way to separate between letting testers create tests and do what they need to do and have the speed that they need, while allowing conformance to have the time to do consensus building in the community so that our end users at the end perceive, for the majority of cases, if need be, that conformance feels like one suite of tests, even if it was an agreed to aggregation of a subset of conformance profiles.
So just
go ahead.
out of clarification, so validation would just be a tag for an extension point, because the way or a tag for a feature set, right? So like if I was talking about storage, it would just be a special annotation, validation storage or something like that, which we already kind of have feature tag annotation for feature sets that cut horizontal in some way, which would be the same thing as same way of you enabling a set of tests to move fast today. So if I do feature storage, that would, which is what's been documented, that would be a way for me to tag or annotate a group of features associated with one another, but that could move fast and then eventually be promoted to something like a profile.
That's essentially the same thing as this. The only thing that the validation suite tag was carrying with it was hey, we think these suites of tests are one day going to eventually either need to go into core conformance or have a discussion of going into a profile, and having that extra notion of these are going to be, well, that's really the main thing, that they're potentially looking at something that we want to keep our eye on, because it's either going to go into core or we're going to have some healthy discussions about it going into a profile. But it was just to help people understand, please let the test creators go fast, but please let the conformance consensus process go slow. Because if you let conformance consensus go slow and pretty much everybody can start adding conformance tags and say, this is now my profile, and this is Srini's profile, and this is so-and-so's profile, it was trying to make the distinction. There are places where we want people to go fast, and there are places where we want to get consensus from the community. And that was what we discussed. If you go watch the video from KubeCon Seattle, that was the whole thing. And then somebody, maybe Dims, came out and said, just call them validation suites. And that's where that term came from.
Okay. So I was not at the KubeCon Seattle, sadly. I know Quentin and Dims made a lot of comments on the PR, and Quentin is here. So Quentin, you had a lot of comments. What say you?
So, sorry, you'll have to remind me which PR we're talking about here.
The validation
suite
PR.
I would have to go and refresh my memory. It was so long ago that I made those comments. I'd be happy to.
I'll put in the link there. So
here's my hot take. I agree with Aaron, and I'll let you go afterwards. Tag team. This already kind of exists, except it's less formal, and I'm a fan of policy. Not necessarily formality with tags. We've created a lot of policy so far, and we don't have enforcement, which is a bummer. But we at least have it documented of what if we could have a pony, this is what it would look like. I don't necessarily see a benefit to adding yet another tag, because that's what it would be. That's my hot take. Handed off to Aaron.
So I feel like I have the exact same hot take, but for context, and maybe I'm misremembering this, where I thought some of the discussion was headed back in Seattle when we were talking face-to-face was around validation that this given CRI implementation actually meets the definition of CRI, or this given CSI driver does all of the things that we would expect of a CSI driver. So sort of drawing that boundary.
That's correct.
And then validating that particular thing works, which personally I just view as wholly orthogonal to conformance testing. To me, conformance testing is, I don't care what CSI or CRI thing is under the covers. I care that when I exercise these set of behaviors that they always work consistently. Totally different from, do you implement CRI correctly?
So if I can jump in, yeah, that makes sense to me as well. So it's like there's two different conformance tests are from the point of view of the user, and it sounds like I wasn't there unfortunately at the Seattle one either. So, but it sounds like what Aaron's talking about is from the point of view of the system, or from the control plane, that some pluggable interface works as expected, which is really a completely different question, and probably doesn't even belong in the, it's not even really an end-to-end test at that point. It's more of a unit almost.
Yeah, well, the example that came up in Seattle was when we were looking at Windows and what we were going to do about Windows. At the time, Windows was pushing for a whole bunch of what's the right word? They wanted to have their own sort of conformance suite where they tweaked the conformance suite, and they had basically they're adding the test, hey, skip if Windows kind of thing. So the other piece of context that we had in Seattle was that. And again, one of the things we were thinking for validation suites was, okay, well, go build a validation suite and see what that does, and then, you know, come back to us. Now, there were some other issues, and some other folks had other concerns with Windows, and they totally changed the model and said, oh, just, I don't know, special rules or something. But all I'm trying to get across, if you can use an existing tag, I don't care. I'm not in love with the tag. I just need people to think and have a way to think. The first thing that should not pop in my head is I'm creating a new conformance profile. So, and the storage is always the classic example, because they're like, well, we have all these storage tests, but not everybody supports storage. What do? Go create a storage profile. So that's what I'm trying to stop from happening, if that makes sense.
I agree. That makes sense. I think at this point we don't have any profiles, right? Like we've managed to resist it, maybe to a fault, but we've managed to resist it. And I don't even know if profiles. Maybe this is too much trouble to stir up, but I don't even know if it's the right approach, right? I mean, like right now we don't even have nearly enough coverage for core. So
agreed.
Begin to profile seems like it's a step too far.
But you know, I know Srini was on. He's going to try and build a whole bunch of suite of storage tests, for example. I don't know if you want to chime in.
Yeah, the idea is basically you bucketize the tests that should be the core behavior of that subsystem, right? I mean, that is what we are going to call as validation, which is a precursor to profiles at some point in time. But unless we provide that path, there will be set of V2E tests which we will be combing through to see which is part of core conformance or whatnot. So,
well, we need to manage. So last meeting of the in the last meeting we talked about some other issues related to optional features, feature enablement. Like there's a bunch of related things, and I think validation suites and profiles are sort of been two attempts to do this. And I was tasked with creating an issue, which I just did before this meeting, that sort of is supposed to be an umbrella and it pulls in all of those. And I don't know, I'm not satisfied, I guess, with either validation suites or profiles as answers for all of the questions of how we deal with optional features and features that like they came up because of HPA that are really considered kind of central features, but rely upon an optional component being deployed in the cluster. Really, DNS, frankly, is not technically required, but it's something we require for conformance right now. So like there's a bunch of, I just think we haven't effectively addressed this issue yet.
Right. And again, I think we were trying to fit the thing that Aaron was talking about, which is people would always show up and say, well, I need a suite of tests that verify X, right? And I didn't want to stand in those people's way. I want them to go build their tests, right? But I didn't want the first thing coming out of their mouth being, oh, and I'm just going to call it a profile. So I'm cool with, you know, here, my personal opinion, if it's not been transparent enough, is I think the day we start doing conformance profiles is the day we tremendously hurt Kubernetes and its ability to run everywhere. That's my personal opinion. So if John says, Brad, you know, I think the best thing is we only have core conformance and we're done, I wholeheartedly agree. The only reason we tried to do validation suites was when I took that very firm position, 4 or 5 different folks popped up and said, yeah, but you're stopping me from building my suite of tests to go validate X. And so I was trying to be a compromise and say, have a process for that, but make sure that's not them thinking, I've got a conformance profile.
So we haven't settled even on the notion of profiles, as John was mentioning earlier. Mm-hmm. Like right now, there's nothing that prevents anyone from using the feature tag, and it's totally out of band. Anyone can do it. So there's nothing that prevents them from doing that today, and they do it all the time. So if you anything that's feature gated in the main repository, even extension points at this point can have a feature wrap flag for doing that, and they do that today. So I think creating distinction before we've actually figured out what we even want to do, it may be a little bit. I think we need to figure out a taxonomy, a layering for this, which we haven't even agreed upon. The HPA issue kind of forced us to re-talk about it, because the problem we currently have is we have V1 APIs that we can't necessarily promote to conformance because they're optional features. Right? HPA is a classic example where like you don't need to have HPA, you don't need to have DNS, as John mentioned. And it's really incumbent upon us to figure out how do we test these things. I don't think validation suites, having yet another tag, kind of fits into this. I do think that the nomenclature you use there I found to be confusing, probably because I wasn't part of the conversation originally. So reading it, I reread it like 3 times, and I was like, it just reads like my interpretation of it equals X. So I am of the point where like I think we need to figure out how to document this stuff, and I think that's a reasonable expectation upon this group to do. And sure. John said he started to open an issue against it. I am not in favor of adding yet another stratification to the existing system.
I think that's entirely fair. And again, the context was there were people at the time, William Dennis, for example, and others, that were pressuring, they were causing pressure and saying that stratification was needed. So the validation suite concept was a response to the pressure we were receiving at KubeCon Seattle. But if we are all in agreement that that pressure is not as severe right now, I'm so cool with that. I'm so cool with, put these things on the shelf, let's go figure it out. But if you remember, at the time, we had the window platform guy come in saying, I need a Windows profile. And we had the storage folks in the room saying, I need a storage profile.
I think this is before,
go ahead.
Before we actually made a sub-project for conformance, right? Like we are executing.
I think
so.
We've progressed and kind of made some decisions. Yeah, no, that sounds good, Brad. Like, I think that we put this on the shelf for now. We figured it out. We worked the other day. It seemed like a premature solution that came out of one meeting, and let's.
It's all good. Like I said,
I just went and. Oh, sorry. I just went and reread that issue and my comments on it and refreshed my memory. So my opinion is that, different from yours, that we absolutely need profiles, and I think I can, very succinctly explain why. I also think that there appear to be other needs for groupings which are different from my understanding of the need for profiles, and I think it's fairly reasonable to allow those kinds of groupings. Storage in my mind is not actually a profile; it's a grouping, for other purposes.
So here, I'm gonna put a pin in this conversation, because one thing we've been really bad at is documenting our thoughts.
So if you feel
strongly,
I was getting to, and it was just a precursor. So the short summary of what I was about to say is, I would be happy, and I think I signed up and I just dropped the ball on reviewing that proposal and or coming up with a counter proposal. And I think I just dropped the ball on that, back in June or whenever it was, and lots of things have happened since then. So I'd be happy to pick that ball up again, have the debates with whoever is interested in having them, either refine what is put on. I think Brad wrote that it had some value. I think I added a lot of comments which is along similar lines to yours, Tim, which is that there's lots of words and lots of different taxonomies that are not entirely clear. I'd be happy to try and help clean that up, either with Brad or anybody else who's going to participate. And I think that would be a useful exercise, if for no other reason that it would allow people like Patrick, who have a very legitimate reason for wanting groupings of conformance tests, which clearly cannot be fulfilled by every single Kubernetes cluster, to actually proceed with a sane path forward.
Right. And and that's an outstanding view, Quentin. The issue, and that's, we used to hear a lot more of that in the past. What has to happen, and that's a fine view, but that view has to be managed properly. And this is what I mean by managed properly. You want 80%, whatever are the things that are, whatever you want to call the sweet spot for Kubernetes. And I want to be careful, because if I don't categorize it right, somebody gets their feathers ruffled. But for giggles, let's say enterprise Kubernetes, you're running enterprise workloads on a public cloud platform. Whatever we do with these things, we're going to want to make sure that all of those equivalence class of platforms support all the same conformance profiles. Because I guarantee you, the day that you decide that Google's okay with supporting its set, and IBM supports its set, Azure supports its set, you have lost workload portability, and you've dramatically damaged.
I agree. And I think this would probably be better dealt with in a specific document. I agree with you, and I think there's a fairly straightforward way around that problem. That I share your concern about the problem. I think the solution to it is fairly straightforward.
So let's keep working on it together, and then, I mean, we knew that day would come. If we're going to go down that route, we just have to go down with training wheels or what have you together.
Okay, so Brad, me, who else wants to be? I think we need a 1-hour conversation where we just discuss the specific thing and try and wrest some useful and commonly agreed upon document out of the one that we have, either by, fixing it or rewriting it. Who wants to be part of it?
I certainly want to be involved in that. I did just post in the chat the link to the issue I created earlier that starts to gather all these things. The thing I left out of there was I should put in this feature enablement. So how we manage feature enablement and with respect to conformance, but and discoverability of feature enablement, which I don't think we really have right now. But that's a place at least we can gather all of that discussion.
Okay. I'd like to pull a moderator rank, and it sounds like the horse is sufficiently beaten here. So
sorry, we had 3 people. Is there anyone else there? So it's me, John.
I'm happy to set up the meeting. So.
Yeah. Why don't we put the details in the document, and if you're interested, you can add yourself to that list, which is an action item about the proposal.
Beautiful. And Srini's going to make it happen. Awesome. Thank you.
Right. Patrick. I want to make sure Patrick has had his hand raised for a long time. I want to make sure he gets a chance.
Yeah, it was just a real short comment. So Brad had brought up the thing about Windows profiles, and the large reason we backed away from it from the time being is personally, one of the goals of the December meeting was to get a path forward on how we would test Windows. And a couple principles that we all agreed upon are that it makes sense for new tests to be written agnostic. And if that means replacing an image with one that is agnostic across OSs is done. That's been an effort that we've been carrying forward. We've got tests that are already tagged as feature windows, and so we're gathering those in a separate suite. And then the last thing was separating the definition of a feature that was considered stable from something that was tested in conformance. And so we're ready to re-engage when the time is right on that, but we're still at the point of both making existing tests OS agnostic and then supplementing with the additional testing we want for the Windows functionality that we want to guarantee is the same regardless of what you're running. So it's going to be one of those long efforts. So that's all I have on that. And so, whether you want to call this a validation suite or a conformance profile, either way, I'd be happy to help define the one that reflects, that Windows is an optional feature that people can somehow opt into and get, a min-bar functionality that's tested for it.
Sounds good. Are there any other questions regarding this? Once, twice, 3 times. We are on to backlog triage unless there are other topics. Hippie, you said it sounded like you wanted to say something there.
No, okay.
Great. Obviously, before I do this one, I want to reiterate that the most important thing listed on our backlog, which we talked about last time, I'll reshare my screen here. Hopefully folks can see my screen. We did a fairly decent amount of backlog grooming and triage. And where's the board?
Project board down.
Yeah. And there is only one thing that is critical importance, and that was the data coming back from II with regards to what is the current coverage we have with just the pod spec and its fields. The next on the list that somebody had added, I don't know who, was a question about dependencies on guestbook applications for conformance. I thought we already talked about something like this before. Didn't we? I swear we talked about this.
Yeah, so I think Claudio brought it up last week, but there was still a question on the approach of, we're basically proposing that if this test case is dependent on, is supposed to be testing the behavior of two pods talking to each other using a service IP, then what we were proposing was splitting it up to where we use something that is like the net exec that's already there and doing some network queries and basically just starting up a second pod that is creating those requests.
We already have tests that cover that now at this point too.
We already talked about this last time. We had the same conclusion when Claudio was here. I don't know if you. It looks like Claudio's on the call.
So Claudio, did you have something new on this for today? Because I thought there was an unresolved question we had from this morning.
Yeah. Last time we didn't actually come to a solution for that thing. I guess today's question is whether we could use the agnostic image to replicate the guestbook application behavior instead of using the Redis images. That is the main question, and something that also Patrick was suggesting.
So the other thing this just brings to mind is this sounds like another domain expert question, except I don't even know which domain expert I'm trying to ask here, because the test name says SIG CLI, kubectl client should be able to create the guestbook application, but I don't understand what set of behaviors that's actually trying to exercise. Like, is this proving that kubectl client can create a thing given some arbitrary resources? Or is it like this specific thing that's exercising these specific behaviors that are tricky for kubectl to exercise? So
now, from what I understand, we can bring in Brian on this one. So Brian said that they originally the guestbook was just what they used for validation, early on, and maybe it's not the most appropriate way to do it at this point. For like, we already have tests that cover each of those specific behaviors. You could have, I guess, it's sort of an overall integration test that's exercising a whole bunch of different behaviors all at the same time, but it's not like a narrowly focused test, it sounds like. What is this exercise that's not already exercised in something else? And then we don't know, I guess is what you're saying, Aaron.
Right. I imagine that this is something folks have used as a proxy for some kind of general smoke test that exercises a couple behaviors.
Yeah.
And if we still need that, then it's probably fair to have the conversation of, is this specific guestbook application with this specific version of Redis no longer suitable for that? Should we rewrite it into something else? Great.
Well, why was Redis upgraded in this anyway? Do we really care? Like, it's a guestbook test.
Yeah, and the reason why is that Redis 5 was needed in order to test IPv6 dual stack. And so for the same reason, like, when they did IPv6 dual stack, various stuff broke. One of the ways they fixed it was they updated the version of Redis, which then broke Windows.
Yeah. So I think it is fair to say that it doesn't matter. The behavior is what matters, not necessarily the image itself. But I also think it's fair to say that this seems more like an aggregate smoke test than it does an actual behavioral driven test.
And my problem is I don't know who owns that aggregate smoke test. If it's that, like, maybe it is this group, maybe it's SIG architecture, maybe we should be talking to SIG networking. This feels like a case where we should be parachuting in some domain experts, and I just don't know who to get involved.
So, Aaron, SIG testing is just the framework and machinery, or what about general smoke tests? Was that part of it?
Just the framework, and we want you to run whatever tests you want to run, but we're not going to tell you how to write them.
And then probably a general smoke test, yeah, it would fall under SIG, and that's the whole point, right? It's everything. It's the only horizontal SIG that makes sense, like, I guess, at least remotely.
I don't own that list of behaviors, nor do I own like which of those should be exercised for us to all agree it's a smoke test, which is why I feel like it's a SIG-ARCS decision when it comes to enumerating behaviors. But it sounds like specifically here, the set of behaviors that we're having questions about are all network related as well.
Well, we're relying upon, we needed to upgrade Redis because of a networking issue, but you know, it just so happens it doesn't work on Windows. I mean, I don't know that, like, it's the application, the guestbook application, maybe it doesn't need to use Redis, right? Maybe it can use something else, and I think that's what Patrick or Claudio was suggesting. So, I don't think networking particularly cares about that, right? Whether it's Redis or not. That's
right. Another thought, without like having an exhaustive list in front of me of where else the guestbook app is used, is that maybe this is something that SIG-APPS owns as a canonical example of what an application on Kubernetes looks like.
This sounds much more like a SIG-APPS test.
Makes sense.
Being proxied through the CLI.
I mean, the one thing that looks kind of different from this, because it's in a SIG CLI test, is it does actually call kube control directly, as opposed to calling the API.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't tell if they're using kube control as part of the validation or not, or if they're just using the API after that.
So in our carrot and stick philosophy, we should raise this one along with the other one, where who is the actual owner of this. So it should be, have you poked SIG-APPS or SIG CLI here?
No, not yet. And if that's the next step you want us to take, we can do that. And so I guess I could just try to find someone that will stand up and assert ownership and say, you know, we'll document this and we'll stand behind it. And if it's SIG CLI and we just change the scope so it still validates their CLI commands in an OS agnostic way, I think we win. If SIG-APPS says, no, we're relying on this as a smoke test, then we'll ask them to take it over and work with us in redefining what that smoke test looks like so it uses the other image.
I think that's a fine action plan.
Claudio, in response to your question on the chat, are you suggesting that you would spin up the agnost image and run a Redis instance on it, or what are you suggesting? Replicating the same behavior?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Well, you said, can we replicate the same behavior, but the behavior is to have a Redis instance running. Are you suggesting you'd run a Redis instance within?
No, basically do everything the applications, but without using Redis, actually.
And you're going to be rewriting the application. I don't know how much they look at whether the application works or not.
Can we restate the action item on that? I'm not sure I was able to capture that clearly.
I think the action.
It's written down.
The action item, as I understood, was to talk to SIG-APPS and talk to SIG CLI and figure out who owns this test. Is that correct? And then build a better understanding from there about whether what approach to take.
All right. Who's taking
That is the action item.
Who's taking it?
I guess I can go ahead and take that one. Does that sound good to you, Claudio? I'll follow up with them, and then we can sync on what we're going to do about the code itself.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay.
We have 3 minutes left. I don't necessarily want to go through the backlog again. We have done it last couple of times. We had an impromptu meeting to go through it. I know that folks have actually been churning against it. I think that the approval list has actually been knocked down a couple of issues, so that's good too. Are there any other last questions, comments, complaints, concerns, given that we have 3 minutes left?
Where's my mute button? I think there was one in the approval column that Clayton had put a hold on a while back. And unfortunately, Clayton's not here to answer it. But I'll just say it out loud to the group. It's the one of, wait, I take back what I said. I don't find it anymore.
It might have gone through. I know which one you're talking about, I
Okay.
think. There is another one in there, though, around adding that provider tag, Aaron. And my only concern with that was, and I just talked to Brian, like if we're going to add that the way the test is written right now, if it merges, it's going to start failing because it's not going to be skipped on GCE and other than GCE and PKE. So are you going to put in tooling so that you skip based on that provider tag like we do with feature tags? Or
I see what your question is. No, you're right. I'll handle that offline.
Okay.
There is one meta topic that I think is worth raising the broader groups to be aware of, that I've uncovered more APIs that have been somehow promoted that somehow like skip the entire conformance test schema. And the more I dig, the more I've been finding. And I don't know how this happened, but it's been happening. So I'm going to be conversing with Jordan about this in more detail. But I think we need to kind of raise that as a awareness for people who are doing API reviews and the SIGs, if they have a CAP, that they need to be responsible for promoting tests.
So one of the things we're also doing, Tim, is, I don't know if you probably saw this production readiness review. Like, I think we need an overall, there's a number of gates that features should go through as they go through from alpha to beta to GA. And right now we don't really, it's just like put in the CAP, your graduation criteria. Like I think we need probably some more formal process around here are the criteria for going to beta, here are the criteria for going to GA. Production readiness review would be part of that. Conformance review, API review is already there, right? At least for getting in. So there's a few things, and it sucks to slow things down, but it's also good to slow things down at the level we're at the maturity level we're trying to get to.
Yeah.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I think this is something that HIPPY's been showing us with API Snoop's coverage going in the wrong direction over time as more APIs have been added.
Yes.
Even though we're adding tests.
I don't have a metric until we reach 0 coverage, but I'm working on it.
To answer Quentin's question real quick, I don't think we have a canonical guide to writing a test well yet. We still lack an example. I can't even think of one off the top of my head of like, this is the perfect test, just copy this. Until we have that, I don't think we should close the issue around, could we have a guide on how to write tests well? This is partially also owned by the Testing Commons subproject, who've been doing a lot of refactoring to the E2E framework and have some specific anti-patterns that they would like avoided. We are chipping away at this iteratively with the requirements to the conformance doc, which I've been asking the IAI folks to update as they encounter roadblocks or questions. Instead of having us answer those questions tribally, those questions should be answered by the doc. And if they aren't, we should update the doc, and this group should come to consensus on whether that's the appropriate answer in the doc.
That's fine. That's what I thought. Tim said that doc had been written when I mentioned the need for such a doc, and so I just wanted to clarify. So the doc has not been written as per that issue number, and we should keep it open and write it. Yeah. Okay, cool.
We have a list of like do's and don'ts, but that's about it.
Yeah. All right. We are at time, so I'm going to call it. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.